Welcome to MEC. I'm curious, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of resilience? Just for fun, I searched examples of resilience on YouTube this week, and some of the top videos were pretty interesting. Here's one. This is the Icelandic strongman, Thor Bjornsson, setting a deadlift world record at over 1,124 pounds. Take a look at this.
Make some noise, world record. Bjornsson of Iceland, 510 kilograms. Ladies and gentlemen, there it is! Wow! And the first thing that comes to mind when you look at that is the fact that that was easy.
It's absolutely crazy. Okay, here's another one that came up. I know a lot of you are still shook over the whole World Cup, and of course, this makes sense why this one came up. Take a look at this.
Pedro Porro, Williams, and thundered into Spain by Ferran Torres!
Okay, if you're a parent, this next one's probably gonna hit home for you. This one was painful to watch. Take a look.
What have you done?
Oh, see.
No, seriously, Jensen, this is naughty. What have you done? Oh.
Okay, those are good, but honestly, I wasn't prepared for this last one. This one really took me off guard, not only because it's a great scene from a great movie, it's a wonderful monologue, but because, well, you just need to watch it. Take a look.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Now, if you know what you're worth, now go out and get what you're worth. But you gotta be willing to take the hits and not pointing fingers saying you ain't where you wanna be because of him or her or anybody. Cowards do that and that ain't you. You're better than that. I'm always gonna love you no matter what. No matter what happens. You're my son, you're my blood. Don't forget to visit your mother.
So there you have it. There's some YouTube resilience for you to chew on. You know, it's easy to joke about resilience, but the truth is resilience is not a byproduct of anything easy. It's not a byproduct of anything fun or anything enjoyable, really. Resilience is hard fought. It's often the byproduct of pain and hardships and burdens and setbacks. You know, we'd all like to think that we're resilient. We'd all like to think maybe that we could become resilient, but do we really know what that means? Do we really know what that actually looks like at the end of the day? You know, I recently read a great book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's called Leadership in Turbulent Times, and it's a masterful work. And I found it really formative when it comes to the topic of resilience. Goodwin does an amazing job observing and comparing the lives of 4 historical giants. You have Abraham Lincoln, you have Theodore Roosevelt, you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, and then you have Lyndon B. Johnson. And she concluded that while each of these men was vastly different from the others, they shared one defining trait, and that was resilience. It's what set them apart. Their individual experiences provided an authentic picture of what resilience actually looks like. You know, I've heard some people define resilience as the speed at which you can return to baseline. In other words, it's like when something unexpected happens, a highly resilient individual can bounce back very quickly, while a low resilient individual has a difficult time returning to baseline. I think that's an okay definition, but I really like how she defines it in her book. She says that resilience is the ability to sustain ambition in the face of adversity. And I just love that. I think that's a wonderful way to describe resilience. In her book, she observed how all four of these great leaders were guided by a moral purpose, which again is ambition, right? And they remained resilient despite the adversity that they all faced. For instance, you have Abraham Lincoln, who had a near suicidal depression. He also faced poverty for most of his life. Then you have Theodore Roosevelt, who lost his young wife and his mother on the same day. You had Franklin Roosevelt, who was struck with polio. He became paralyzed from the waist down. And then you have Lyndon Johnson, who suffered a nearly fatal heart attack. And with every single one of them, did any one of them throw in the towel? No. They remained passionately ambitious in the face of adversity. But here's what I want you to understand. Resilience goes so much deeper than just human strength alone. There's a spiritual dynamic to this that you've got to understand, and you've got to apply it if you want to experience a truly resilient life. And today, we're going to do that by exploring a man in the Bible. I want to introduce you to him, who really experienced resilience firsthand. His name's Joseph, and when it comes to cultivating a resilient life, Joseph's our guy. Similar to Goodwin, I want to use his story as a case study for this series because I think you'll find his story incredibly inspiring as we try to grow our understanding of what a truly resilient life actually looks like. So let's dive in. Let me tell you a little bit about Joseph's backstory, tell you a little bit about how his upbringing was. So we find Joseph's story in the book of Genesis in the Bible. We read how Joseph grew up the favorite of his father, the favorite son of his father, Jacob. He had 11 brothers, but Joseph was just different. You know, he was the first son of Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel. And Jacob really made no secret of his favoritism. He gave Joseph this amazing coat. It was often called the coat of many colors. But this wasn't just a sentimental type gift. This was a coat that represented authority and status. It marked him as management, not just labor. So while his older brothers were out working the fields, Joseph was put in the leadership position over them. And his father positioned him as more of the overseer. And as we'll see throughout Joseph's story, he really was a gifted leader. He wasn't put in that position just because he was favored. At just 17 years old, he already had genuine leadership ability beyond his years. And his father saw something in him that was different, something real. I mean, there was something else very unique about Joseph that we'll get into a lot in this series, and today we'll even get into it a little bit. Something that really marked his story. Joseph started to have dreams. In fact, he had 2 vivid dreams that the Bible intentionally documents in his early life. 2 dreams that were so real and so compelling that Joseph just couldn't ignore them. In the first dream, Joseph and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in the field, and Joseph's sheaf stood up, and all his brothers' sheaves gathered around and bowed down to it. And in the second dream, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to Joseph. These weren't subtle dreams. They were unmistakable visions of authority and rule. And Joseph was going to be elevated above his entire family. Now, at 17 years old, Joseph didn't really fully understand what these dreams meant or what God was doing. So he did what a lot of us would do in an encounter of that. He shared all of that. He told them about his dreams, and he told his family and his brothers. And there's actually a piece of artwork. I think it's called Joseph's Explaining His Dreams. I'll put that up for you. It's Raphael's fresco from 1541. You can see that those 2 circles represent each dream, and there's Joseph trying to explain them to his family. Now, as Joseph's story unfolds, you're going to see how God uses dreams throughout his life to lead him, to guide him, to really shape his story. But at 17, things just aren't clear to Joseph yet. He's still figuring all that out. So when he told his brothers about those dreams, he really had no idea how deeply that would anger them. I mean, really anger them. He was just processing, right? He was just trying to figure out what God was showing him. But his brothers, all that they heard was that there was a 17-year-old kid basically saying, hey, one day you're going to bow down to me. And obviously they didn't take to that very well. They really hated him for that. Not just being favored, but for being given authority over them while he was still a kid. So the resentment ran deep. And so that's really where we first find Joseph. He's young, he's favored, he's positioned above his brothers, he's gifted with a vision of greatness from God himself, and he had every reason to believe that his life was headed somewhere extraordinary. But that's not exactly what happens next. As the story continues, we read how Joseph's brothers were away working in the pastures. And Jacob told Joseph, hey, go check on them to see how they're getting along. And this would have been anywhere from a 4 to 5 day journey for Joseph. And little did they both know that Joseph would not be coming back. And that's where I want to pick up the story from there. Let me read. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him. Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and they threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. And then, just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and they saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelites, traders, taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern, sold him for 20 pieces of silver, and the traders took him to Egypt. Sometime later, Reuben returned to get Joseph out of the cistern. When he discovered that Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief. Then he went back to his brothers and lamented, the boy is gone. What will I do now? Then the brothers killed a young goat, dipped Joseph's robe in its blood. They sent the beautiful robe to their father with this message. Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son? Their father recognized it immediately. Yes, he said, it's my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him. Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces. His family all tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. I will go to my grave mourning for my son, he would say, and then he would weep. Okay. There's a lot to break down in all of that. So let's dive in. So first of all, we've got to acknowledge how traumatic this would have been for Joseph. I mean, put yourself in his shoes for a second. These weren't strangers. This was kin. This is people he grew up with, people who were supposed to be the family to him, and yet it's the family that wanted him dead. And notice what they called him. Here comes the dreamer. Right? It's like they didn't even want to use his name anymore. He'd been reduced to a joke, an obstacle. It was just something to get rid of. He was already dead in their minds, right? So they stripped him of his coat, the one that represented his status, his father's love, and it also represented his future, right? And then they throw him into the pit. And let's talk about that for a second. So you might picture a well or a small hole in the ground, but you need to understand what a cistern actually was in that culture. Here's what the opening might have looked like. You can see that. Cisterns were carved out of solid rock. They were pear-shaped and typically 15 to 20 feet deep. The opening at the top was only 2 to 3 feet across. And during the rainy seasons, these cisterns would fill with water. And so that was essential for survival in a desert climate. But during the dry seasons, when the rain stopped, they'd empty out completely. And so this cistern that Joseph's brothers would have thrown him into, it was empty. It told us that. That means that the bottom of this cistern would have been hard. In trauma medicine, a fall from 20 feet is recognized as a critical threshold for major trauma. So we're talking about the equivalent of falling from a 2-story building. A fall like that would have caused Joseph severe injuries. So he literally hit rock bottom. And of course, there's no way to climb out. The walls are too high, too steep. So while his brothers walk away to share a meal, Joseph would have been left there with severe injuries, in complete darkness, awaiting a slow and painful end to his life. And then you might think it was mercy that the brothers went back and pulled Joseph out to send him into, or to sell him into slavery. But that wasn't mercy. That was greed. He was dead to them anyway. At least with this option, they get 20 pieces of silver out of their trouble, right? So can you imagine being 17 years old and you're ripped out of your family, you're ripped out of your home, you're thrown into a near-death situation only to be pulled out so that you can be sold off to a foreigner as a slave? Okay, that's traumatic. And here's what I want you to see. Joseph didn't do anything to deserve this. He really didn't. Now, obviously, he wasn't perfect. That dream sharing stuff probably wasn't the most tactful moment, but nothing he did warranted all this. And I imagine some of you have felt that way. Maybe you're feeling that way right now. You've taken hits that just feel unfair to you. Maybe you know what it's like to be betrayed by someone who was supposed to love you, or someone who was supposed to be a safe place for you, a parent, a spouse, a friend, a mentor, someone who was supposed to stand by you. But instead, they were the one who hurt you the most. That's the kind of experience that can really disillusion you. It's the kind of betrayal that some people never bounce back from. And so what does resilience look like in those kinds of moments? Well, let's get back to the story. So Joseph is sold into slavery. He's taken from everything he knows, his father, his home, his identity, and then he's transported to Egypt as a slave. And everything he experienced in those dreams seems completely impossible now. How could any of that happen when he's a slave at the bottom of society? This really is rock bottom. And so this is the moment where most people would give up, right? Most people would think, okay, my life's over. God abandoned me. These dreams are false. I'm finished here. So let me read what happens next. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Okay, there's a few things that I want to point out with this. So first, Joseph gets picked up by one of the most prestigious individuals in ancient Egypt. This guy is second only to Pharaoh. He's highly successful, he's enormously wealthy, and he no doubt has a highly expansive portfolio to manage. And we know that Joseph managed his father's affairs, but this is on an entirely different level. In other words, Joseph's status wasn't just reinstated, he was put in charge of way, way more. Like, it's hard to put it in terms that would be like make sense for modern day, but in Egypt, it was an enormously wealthy society. And so the bigger part of that too is that Joseph was up to that challenge. That's huge. Now you might be thinking, okay, time out. Like, what happened? This guy was jumped, left for dead, and now he's already serving at one of the highest levels in ancient Egypt. How is that possible? Okay, what happened? What did I miss? Where did the resilience come from? Well, it actually told us exactly how Joseph was so successful. I'm curious if you caught it. Right there in verse 2, it said that the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. Okay, that's big. Don't miss this. I want you to notice something remarkable about this, okay? Throughout everything Joseph has experienced so far, the betrayal, the pit, the sale into slavery, being stripped of his identity, transported to a foreign land, we never read that Joseph complained. We never read that he argued with God or blamed God. We never read that he was angry or confused. Not one time. The only thing Scripture tells us is that the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. Now, don't blow that off, okay? That's significant. The Bible tells us all throughout Scripture that God is omnipresent, right? Meaning that his Spirit is everywhere at all times. But that's not necessarily what this verse is talking about. It's talking about something much deeper than just God's presence alone. It actually tells us a lot about Joseph. You see, in the book of Psalms, we read that the Lord is near to all who call on him. That's in Psalm 145. And, maybe that gives you a hint at what's going on here. Joseph's resilience didn't come from just knowing God was there. It came from calling on God. He chose to lean into God's presence. Remember our definition of resilience, right? Resilience is the ability to sustain ambition in the face of adversity. So you see, Joseph shows us something very important. His ambition wasn't to be strong. It wasn't to be successful. His ambition was to know and follow God. That's what he was sustaining through the entire time of this. His resilience was built by pursuing God through his pain, through his trauma, through his circumstances. He didn't keep God out. He let God in. And the Bible also tells us that the Lord hears his people when they call on him for help. He rescues them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. That is probably one of the most profound things we could take away from today. I hope you soak it in. That is the difference. Okay, that's why Joseph was so resilient. And honestly, that's why so many of us aren't as resilient as we'd like to be. We're trying to sustain the wrong ambition. We think that if we can lift heavy weights, we're resilient. We think if we can have patience with our kids, we're resilient. We think that if we can handle the pressures of work, we're resilient. But do you see how backwards that is? Do you see how shallow that is? It doesn't address resilience at the root. And not only that, but we try to achieve our wrong ambitions with our own strength. It's crazy, right? When you actually think about it. Let me tell you something. That's not the resilient life that we're talking about in this series. Please listen carefully, okay? If there's one thing you take away, it's this. True resilience, the kind that's real, the kind that lasts, the kind that transforms every aspect of your life, is only built when you make God your ambition and you stop relying on your own strength and you start relying on his. The Bible says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. It doesn't say that I can do all things by myself without help, right? Through him. Make God your ambition and stop relying on your own strength and start relying on his strength. It reminds me of a scene from one of my favorite movies, which came out back in, 1946. It tells a story of a man named George. And George hit rock bottom, just like Joseph. It was only when he hit the bottom that he finally realized who he needed to turn to. And I want to show you this scene from this movie. You may have seen this before, but I found it to be very powerful. Take a look.
Yeah, Merry Christmas! Glad you come. How about some of that good spaghetti? We got everything.
Voglio cantare una canzone d'amore.
God. Oh, God. Dear Father in heaven, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there and you can hear me, show me the way. I'm at the end of my rope. Show me the way, oh God.
So many of us experience moments in life that bring us to our knees. And You may not have met God on the way up, but you're getting pretty close to him on the way down. Make no mistake, Joseph was on his knees. And when trust was broken in every other area of life, he turned directly to God and he put his trust in him as the true source of resilience. And God met him there. Joseph could have chosen bitterness. He could have chosen resentment. He could have held a grudge against his brothers, against his circumstances, against God himself. He could have chosen anger, could have, brokenness, revenge, but he didn't. Instead, Joseph chose to bend the knee. He trusted God. And that one move changed everything. It was a defining moment. It was a turning point in his life. And here's the truth for you. You have the same choice that Joseph had. When betrayal comes, when brokenness comes, when setbacks come, when loss comes, you can choose bitterness, you could choose resentment, you could choose anger and brokenness, or you can choose what Joseph chose, which is to trust God. That's true resilience. It's not self-made toughness. It's not pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? It's the ability to sustain your character, your faith, your integrity when everything around you is screaming that you should give up. And that only happens when you put your trust in God. So is that it? Well, not exactly. Everything about Joseph's resilience so far had to do with what was done to him. It was his circumstances. But the real question is, what about his character? And for Joseph, this was about to get real. I want to read you what happens next. Okay. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He's held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. And one day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. Okay, let's stop there. While Joseph's experience with his brothers required resilience when something was done to him, this experience required Joseph to be resilient in the face of a different kind of adversity, right? This had everything to do with Joseph's integrity. It wasn't just one moment of resilience. It says that this went on day after day. That means that Joseph's resilience, first of all, wasn't fleeting. I mean, this was a true test of character. You can only imagine how his reliance on God must have been day after day. If you remember our definition of resilience we looked at earlier, it's resilience is the ability to sustain ambition in the face of adversity, okay? So it's not just about having ambition, it's about sustaining it day after day, year after year. So Joseph did the right thing. He chose integrity over lust. He chose obedience over desire, and that's true resilience. Okay, let's keep reading. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed, and when he heard me scream, he ran outside and he got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home, and then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Here we go again. So Joseph did the right thing, and yet what was his reward? He was lied about. His reputation was destroyed by the very woman he refused. And when he fled from her, she was left holding his cloak. And I always loved this detail in the Bible. It was the garment that, again, would represent a lot, right? Do you see the pattern? So years earlier, his brothers stripped him of his father's special coat before throwing him in the pit. And now, in a moment of doing the right thing, his status is ripped from him again, and his reputation is erroneously destroyed. He was thrown into prison for a crime he didn't even commit. And most people would totally break at that point, right? Most people would say, okay, I tried to do the right thing, and look at where it got me. It's like, God, where are you? Why would you let this happen to me? But what was Joseph's response? Well, he wasn't like most people, was he? Let me read what happened. It says, but the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. I just think that's crazy. That's just wild, right? That is a resilient life. Again, we don't hear a single complaint. We don't hear a single curse word, not an ounce of doubt or confusion. We just see Joseph go back to God time and again, and God just kept showing up, kept providing. He maintained his faith even when faithfulness seemed to cost him everything. And that takes a whole different level of resilience, one that only comes through putting our trust in God. And so here's the question that we really need to ask ourselves as we leave today, all right? What would it look like for us to have this kind of resilience in our lives? When life throws its hits, and it will, are we going to be prepared? I want to distill some of this in terms of Joseph's story, just into really maybe 3 takeaways that I think we can all think about this week with this first installment. The first one is this. Joseph had vision, and we're going to get into more of that in the weeks to come, but God gave him dreams, a clear picture of his future, something to move towards, something to hold on to when everything seemed to be falling apart. When his brothers threw him into a pit, that vision could remind him that this isn't the end of his story. When he was enslaved, that vision kept him moving forward. When he was falsely accused and imprisoned, he could see past it because he had vision. So that's first. But vision alone isn't enough. Here's the second thing. Joseph didn't just know about God, he walked with God. And man, there is a difference. The difference is trust. Joseph invited God into his pain, into his betrayal, into his slavery, into his temptation. That's trust. That's what separates a normal life from a resilient life. Because remember, Joseph's resilience wasn't one-dimensional. He couldn't afford to be physically strong but emotionally broken. He couldn't be spiritually wavering. He couldn't resist temptation while everything else was falling apart. His resilience had to be holistic. It covered every dimension of who he was as a person. And again, that's only possible with God. So do you trust God like that? Can you say without blushing that God is your ambition? Well, that's the first step in a truly resilient life. But honestly, there's so much more that we're going to dive into in this series. We've only scratched the surface of Joseph's story. It's a fascinating story. And so right now, Joseph's back in prison, back in darkness, back where it feels like he started. He's stripped of status, stripped of freedom, facing another trial. The question that hangs over next week is this: does he have the resilience to keep going when it's not just one crisis, but a period of waiting on God? When months turn into years in a prison cell, where's God in all of that? That's what we're going to explore next week. I'm really excited about it because resilience isn't just about bouncing back from one hard thing. It's about sustained resilience, fighting the good fight even when the journey is long and the victory feels in the distant. So I hope to see you next week for that. I think it's going to be an amazing conversation. Until then, let me pray for you. Father, thank you so much for Joseph's story. Thank you for just all the nuggets of truth, all the wisdom that's laid out for us there. We all want resilient lives. We want to be able to experience that trust, right, that we have in you. And so my prayer this week is that we'll all reflect on that. Are you our true ambition? Or are we making about other things that don't matter? If we're going to go the long run, we need to start there. Pursue you, trust in you as our one ambition. So I pray that for all of us this week. And I pray it in your name.